Now let's start our keynote fireside chat. Today's keynote is Professor Steven Chu. This will be moderated by Professor Arun Majumdar. Let me give a quick introduction about them. So I believe nearly all of you know about them already. So Steve has his PhD from UC Berkeley. I'll tell you why I mentioned UC Berkeley right here. And after getting physics PhD, working in a Bell lab, joining Stanford faculty, winning Nobel Prize, and then after Nobel Prize, he feels like the world has a problem he needs to fix. He decided to join the Department of Energy as the Secretary of Energy during Obama administration, and recruiting Professor Arun Majumdar to join him to start the ARPA-E program. That's a signature program in Department of Energy. And Arun got his PhD at UC Berkeley as well, working with Professor Tian Changling. I think same lab as Professor Gang Chen at the time. And I did my postdoc at UC Berkeley, and that's the Berkeley connection. Even though among our student body, Stanford and Berkeley having this game going on, but you can see the cross-fertilization across the bay. And, but conclusion is they all come to Stanford. So this is also telling you Stanford is probably an okay place to hold this event. With that short introduction, let me just make one last comment. They are not only the top scientists and engineers, they are also just incredible public servers serving in the government, doing the great thing for the whole nation and for the whole world. I myself consider them as my mentor, now as good friends and colleagues. Now let's welcome Professor Steven Chu and Professor Arun Majumdar to the stage.
Good morning. Well, it's such an honor to have Professor Steven Chu here. And, we were fascinated by the discussion this morning by Professor Ting. And I was going to sort of go in the same direction, Steve. In your Nobel Prize work was done in Bell Labs on laser cooling. But you had done a few things before that as well. So perhaps you could tell the audience, what got you into that direction of science and the work that you had done in Bell Labs. And, there were some probably setbacks and people didn't believe it and all. So tell us about that story.
Sure, thanks for the question. When I was a graduate student and postdoc at UC Berkeley with my then advisor, Eugene Cummins, he and other mentors strongly advised me, stick with the most fundamental questions in physics, don't mess around with anything else, that's your plan. Other people, like Art Shallow, who became a colleague of mine at Stanford, said, and oh, by the way, don't write any books, don't write any review articles, you're too valuable for that stuff. So I was nurtured and petted and all these other things since I was very young. But I have to say that it wasn't all roses in my graduate student career. I tried 2 or 3 other projects before landing on the right one. And so you could say I had 3 failures and 1 partial success. It was only a partial success, which my postdoctoral thesis work. But when I get to Bell Labs, I started working on a very impossible experiment, a positron and an electron. It's an atom formed by an electron, its antiparticle, to do spectroscopy, laser spectroscopy on this atom where no one had even excited the atom before. It only lasts 140 nanoseconds. So we did it, and then 2 years later, we measured the energy level to a few like 100 parts in a billion. And so all of a sudden, even though the measurement didn't lead to anything really new, no new surprise, they said, oh, you can do that experiment. So when I get to Holmdel to head up a department of basic research there, and then there's where I met Art Ashkin, and Art was trying to get me involved in this. He said, you know, the work had started in 1970, 71, but by the early 80s, 82, actually by 78, 79, management had shut down the work. Said, it's a great idea, but you haven't been making any progress, so you got to stop it. And so I got there in 83, I looked at what they had been doing, and said, no, it wasn't going to work. But it was able to do an end run around it by happening to independently discover a 10-year-old idea of how to use light to cool atoms. The proposers of the idea, Ted Hench, Arcello, didn't think it was that important, never tried the experiment. When Arcello got his Nobel Prize in 83, he mentioned many things, and I said, but he never mentioned the laser cooling paper. And I asked Art why. He said, in 1983, we didn't know it was going to be important. And so the work was done in 84, 85. And so it's ironic how these things go. Going back to the story, this is part I do share with Sam Ting when he told us about how, you know, many people in a series of experiments didn't think it was going to work. My thesis experiment was very hard. People didn't think it was going to work. But for sure, Bell Labs said, no, we've tried this. We tried positronium several times. This is not going to work. Then I got that to work. And so when I told my boss, Chuck Schenck, I want to try to laser cool atoms. This is so simple, it's got to work, and then we can trap them. He kind of looked at me and said, well, you earned the right to try it, but it's not going to work. So don't try to talk anyone else into helping you. But anyway, so he let me do it, and within a year, it worked. It worked very rapidly. But certainly, in all these experiences, I was told almost uniformly it's not going to work. Now, since that time, I would go into new fields, single molecule biology, biophysics, manipulating DNA for polymer experiments, just all down the line, single molecule thread on surfaces, uniformly rejected, never going to work. Except being rejected at Bell Labs, you can still sneak it on the side. Being rejected by the NIH or the NSF is different. You have to go visit Rob liquor stores or something. I don't know, but anyway, it's not easy, and for you young people, it's a tough decision. If you really believe it's going to work, try. But in the end, you know, I told Bell Labs people for positronium, they said, it hasn't worked in a year and a half. We have high hopes for you. We want you to start a new field, but you're ruining your career trying to do this experiment. So I said, give me half a year. I got one more thing to try, maybe two. And if it doesn't work, I'll agree to leave. And it worked. So you know, there's always this pressure of when you stop and when you think you should continue.
Well, let's go backward in your life as opposed to forward. And you were born in St. Louis, and your father came here. Your parents came here. Your dad was a graduate student.
Yes.
And then moved to New York, and he grew up in a family with two other brothers. And I've heard you say that you're the black sheep of the family. Explain that.
Well, okay, so my parents, born in China, they met at Tsinghua when Tsinghua, Beida were part of the Southwestern thing during World War II. My father was a few years older. During the war, he went to MIT as a graduate student. My mother joined him as a graduate student at MIT, and then they started raising a family. In the late 1946, I was born in 48, and then 50 for my younger brother. So they both come from very distinguished families, scholars on both sides, scholars meaning they were PhDs, study in Europe or in the US, come back to China. And it was always expected that all of us would become scholars. That was the highest level of achievement we were told when we were very young. You know, it's not about getting money, it's about being a real scholar. And so that's what we were told. My older brother, who's a professor here at Stanford in biochemistry and in oncology in the medical school, went through high school with the highest cumulative average, not only of that year, but in the record of the high school. And so I was coming up, and the teacher said, "Oh, you're Gilbert's brother, you're gonna do just as well, we're so excited." Couldn't live under the pressure. You know, dropped out of high school for 3 months, 9th grade, finally went back to school. Didn't get serious as a student until senior year. Then, so my brother went to Princeton. I applied to Princeton, Yale, got rejected. Also Brown got rejected, but Rochester and Stony Brook were my safety schools, and Rochester took me. Best thing that ever happened to me in my life. No one ever heard of my older brother. And so I could be my own person. And so now why does that make me a black sheep? Well, you know, I'm struggling, 6 years of PhD, things like that. And it wasn't clear. Meanwhile, my younger brother, he dropped out of high school his junior year, never graduated from high school, but talked his way into UCLA after running around as a kind of a crazy man for a year. But he wasn't that dumb. He got a PhD at 21 and then got 2 degrees in Yale and Harvard in law. So he was, by then, one of the most famous patent litigators in the United States by the time he was 38 or 35. And so it was a little scary growing up in that family. I was the only person in the extended family to not go to an Ivy League school. I was the first.
So you're the underachiever in the family, which is great. So now let's talk about your work at Bell Labs you described. Then you came to Stanford, and you set up a lab out here. And what were you thinking when you went from Bell Labs? Did you want to change your direction? And also explain how you were thinking about it.
So when I came to Stanford, I certainly wanted to continue with laser cooling trapping, but I also made a very conscious effort to say I want to use this optical tweezer method. This is first used to trap atoms. That was part of my Nobel Prize, and then part of Art Ashkin's Nobel Prize, in that case, to use optical tweezers for molecular biology. Art in the middle 80s, 85, 86, discovered that you can trap E. coli, and you can go inside of yeast and hold on to organelles there. And so I thought this was great. So I told Art before I left, Art, you can do these things in biology with live cells. We can do this stuff with atoms. I'm going to try to see if we can do this with individual molecules, and we'll cheat. We'll put a little polystyrene sphere so the light can grab onto it, onto a biomolecule, and then move it around and make measurements. 2 years later, it worked. And I was in a conference. Art was first row of the audience. And I said, "Hey, Art, this stuff really works." And he said, "Oh my God, I didn't believe you, but it does." And he just took off with it after that. And so, you know, he finally got his well-deserved Nobel Prize. But, you know, I'll stop this, but I just want to say that it's very hard to foresee what happens in any discovery. And laser cooling trapping was a technique. It was a method. And in the history of science, when you develop a new method, a new instrument, a new technique, that's when things really explode, because you discover things that you didn't anticipate, and things that we couldn't easily understand. The famous quote of Feynman by Sam Ting, which was great. And so that's one of the great things about science. It's that the new method opens up new frontiers.
So when you were doing your science, you became the department chair of the physics department, and then suddenly you decided that you are going to go into administration in a big way, and he became the national lab director for the lab director for Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and which is where you and I interacted quite a bit at that time. What made you decide to go from an amazing scientific career and go into dealing with, operations and Department of Energy and all of that?
Well, they had asked, my former boss at Bell Labs, Chuck Shanker, was director for 15 years. UC had to recompete for the contract. They needed a new director. They asked me whether I'd consider it, and I said, no, I'm happy where I am. Bert Richter, then head of SLAC, said, Steve, you'd be perfect job. You should really consider it. And I said to Bert, no, I'm very happy where I am. Okay, so after 2 no's, my boss, the director of LBN, said, just show up and keep an open mind. If there's a 5% chance you'll take the job. But by this time, in 2004, I'd been talking for about 4 years about energy climate change issues as kind of an amateur, but beginning to read a lot of the literature and getting more concerned about it. So in the summer of 2004, I asked myself, here you are giving talks on the threats of climate change. Here's Lawrence Berkeley Lab, a great laboratory next to UC Berkeley. It was a really great lab, is a very great laboratory. 15 employees have gotten Nobel Prizes, worked at the lab. Even more impressive, over 30 people started their careers at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, went on to get Nobel Prizes, which is amazing. And so I said, if I can get people interested in this area, not you can't tell them what to do. They're, independent, strong-willed, brilliant scientists. But you want to perk their interest. And so if I can get them interested, it may be worth it. So I finally said, okay, I'll go there, begin to give talks about what the issues were, what the challenges were, what the consequences were if we didn't start moving on this. And a number of people, including Yi when he was a postdoc there, but also a number of other people, both young and middle career people, began to shift their careers. And so that was, so it kind of worked, and I was thinking, okay, I don't want to be a bureaucrat. After 5 years, I stepped back to going into science. But then, when Obama got elected in late November, he asked whether I would join him in his cabinet. First I said, no, I'm not really interested. And he said, just fly to Chicago and talk to the president-elect. So I said, okay. So I walked in, so we have a one-on-one conversation for an hour. And he walks into a room and says, everybody's telling me you should be the next Secretary of Energy. I say, who are these future former friends of mine? And then he said, well, I want 2 things in my presidency. The 2 major goals I want is to reform US healthcare and to do something meaningful about climate change. And it will be in energy. And so I want you to be that person in energy. So after an hour of talking to him, realizing this guy was an exceptional person, I told my wife afterwards, if he asks, I'll join. He asked, I joined.
That's an amazing story. And just going back a little bit, in Berkeley, in Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, many of us were working on all kinds of different things. We listened to Steve talk about climate change in a way that is simple, understandable, but yet deep. And many of us changed our fields, our work in that direction. So you inspired a whole generation of scientists, engineers, and others as well. Going to DOE now, just to make a point, I know you didn't, Steve is the first scientist ever in the history of the United States to become a cabinet member. The first one. Leave alone the Nobel Prize for the time being, just the first scientist. Tell us your experience as a scientist going into DOE. Here you're dealing with the political world and everything else. So tell us about your experiences on that.
Well, there was all sorts of predictions of what would happen. There was a very seasoned staffer on the Hill who did energy and water, and he wanted to meet with me just to tell me I'm doomed to fail. And, I know nothing about Washington politics, any of that stuff. It's not going to work, but hey, congratulations. And so what I found was not quite that. It turns out that number one, you have to win the legislature over. You can't. It's not just on the executive side. President Obama backed me to the hilt and everything, and so he covered my back. I similarly would hire brilliant people, not so I can tell them what to do. I hired Arun. When I was lab director, I made him a division director. He hadn't been a department head or even a section head at LBNL or UC Berkeley. So all of a sudden he's in charge of a $90 million a year budget on energy efficiency, renewable energy. And so he learned fast. But one of the things that Arun has, and what you need to deal in Washington, is to be able to explain to people in simple terms, understand where their level is, and understand in truthful, simple terms, what are the issues, can they really understand it? And that's what's really needed. And so when you do it that way, a lot of the political resistance begins to melt away. And so one tries to, it's not us against them, it's a, here's what I think is happening, this is why we think it's happening. They would ask questions. So it's a conversation. And they could sometimes be skeptical, and I would say, well, okay, that we don't know, but yes, this we do know. And so it was a conversation. And you did this yourself beautifully. That's the other thing. The staffers at DOE said only the Secretary of Energy is allowed to talk to people in Congress, but Arun was really good. There's a few others. And I said, no, don't worry about it. He's allowed to go. Just let him do it. And so, Arun, you were great at that. Bill Brinkman was less good, but still very effective. And so there was also this resistance. So it was an interesting time in the Department of Energy. For the first time, I really wanted to understand what was happening at a program, at a really basic level of what's going on. I would get these briefings from assistant deputy secretaries or deputy secretaries of certain divisions. I started asking technical questions. They wouldn't know the answers. So I said, okay, next time, why don't you come back with people who can answer these questions, but you can come too. And so it got around that I was engaged, asked questions, not to, you can guide a lot of people by asking questions. And getting to think about it. And that's part of their self-discovery of doing this. But it was great fun, and I think at that time brought in fabulous people in the Department of Energy, maybe 30 or so, getting on the phone, calling them up myself. That's something secretaries never do either. But it was simple. I said, look, you didn't believe I would work for the government, but here I am. Come join me. We're here to save the world. It worked, and half the times. So it was a great time, and those people have left basically since I left, and they're out there doing great things like Arun, like many other people around the world.
Moving forward, you have dedicated your career, your life, profession, and addressing issues related to climate change, and you care deeply about this. This is a global issue. How are we doing as a world in that?
It's a very mixed bag, but overall, and we can do much better, not as well. There's been a recent setback led by the United States. I hope that reverses. On the good side, there are certain technologies that are going to be very successful. Solar is very successful. Utility-scale batteries are plunging, and so the combination of utility-scale batteries and solar will transform the world. You can make power, energy locally, store it locally, and it's projected by 2030 that solar batteries and electricity, where you have 90% of the time you have access to electricity, with enough battery storage, be 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour in China, maybe 6 cents in the US. Very, very low. And so when that happens, I think it's be as exciting as when cell phones happened. After cell phones happened, you no longer needed telephone lines. After this happens, you can start pockets of energy production here, there, locally in both rich and poor countries, developing countries, all over the place. And so it's going to be very exciting. So we're doing great on that, EVs. We just need a fast charge battery that Yitui discussed, but that's going to happen. So those are the good things. Bad things are we have an agricultural problem. Greenhouse gases in agriculture have not been solved yet. We ultimately have to get rid of fertilizer, which, if not absorbed by the plant, emits N2O, which is 300 times worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, lasts 100 years. It will become double digit, like 15% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the next 20 years. So we've got to do something about that. No solution there. So there are a few other things. We'd still need more political will to encourage industries, inventors, scientists to solve these other problems. But so it's a mixed bag. And people, let me just say that people don't realize how serious this is. They see the weather today, but there's a built-in time delay. 90% of the heat goes in the ocean, of which half of that heat, 40% or so, is in the deep ocean, and it takes 50, 100 years to come to new thermal equilibrium. It's the surface of the ocean land that determines the weather. And so there's a built-in getting worse factor that will have a 50 to 100-year delay from what we've already done, which is very scary, because in the last decade, it's not been good news.
So we're going to open it up for questions for Steve. So if you want to ask a question, just line up in front of the two mics. So let me ask you the last question before we open it up. As a cabinet member of the United States, you're automatically a global citizen. Whether you like it or not, you are. And as a Nobel Laureate, you're automatically a global citizen. So you're a global citizen twice, so much for being an underachiever. As you look at the world right now, and you look at some of the things going on, and especially in the US and China, what comes to your mind? What would you recommend that we do about this partnership, or the lack of it, between US and China?
Yeah, the deteriorating relationship, I would say mostly started with the US, is very, very sad. I think US and China have the capability and could benefit immensely if we started collaborating. When I was Secretary of Energy, I said, we can collaborate on things like energy efficiency, design of better cities, things like that don't really compete on the marketplace, like we thought electric vehicles, but then you said, no, that's competition. But I think there's so much to be gained if we do collaborate and get away from this, that I think both the ideas, the blend of new ideas, new discoveries, and the ability to rapidly commercialize, which China excels in, is something that we need to do. And I, for one, would love it if we can reestablish these relationships against this common threat. I used to say, I still say, suppose we Earthlings were being invaded from Mars, and there are all these alliances and strifes and things like that in the world. But there's no question in my mind, all the people on Earth would get together and say, we've got to repel the common enemy, the Martians. Okay, now we have a common enemy, the prospect of very dire consequences in climate change and environment in general. So we should be able to come together with this.
Okay, we're going to go into the Q&A from the audience. Just just say your name, be very brief with your question so we can get to many. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you, Steve and Arun, for the very nice dialogue here. And Also, thank you for all the great work. My name is Ling Hua. I work for a renewable independent power producer here in San Francisco. And my question for you is, it seems like right now, one of the biggest challenge is really the transmission to deliver the renewables to the load and data center and customer and help solve the climate change. What is your suggestion? How do we solve that in this very fragmented, state by state, this type of situation?
Yeah, this is a great question. It was a real issue even when I was Secretary of Energy since the very beginning. At that time, it took 11 years from the time of application to get a transmission line approved and built. Only 2 years to build it, but 9 years of environmental impact statements, this, that, and the other thing. And so I said, surely we can reduce this to 3 years. Big meeting that all the relevant, Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Interior, Secretary of Energy, all these people got together. And I remember Ken Zalazar said, if this is really going to work, someone's got to be in charge of this. So I raised my hand. I'll do it. So Ken says, fine. And then he calls me up an hour later and says, I can't support you on this. I said, why not? He says, well, my people in the Department of Interior, Game and Wildlife, said, if he's in charge, it might happen. So we don't want him in charge. So there is this inertia, and it still takes too long a time. And it's still, people are still complaining about that. So there are things like that. If you're in a place with inexpensive energy, the local citizens don't want it exported because it might raise your energy rates, even though overall the country would do much better. We'd have more energy resiliency. So there's a lot of local politics involved as well. But they don't they don't fight you by calling you up and trying to convince you otherwise. They fight you by going to their people in Congress, in the House and the Senate, and say, stop this.
It's political.
It's pure politics. But you do what you can, and eventually you hope that things will work out.
Okay.
Let's go to the lady in front over here.
Okay.
Brief question.
So hi, this is Amy Gao. I'm a 10th grade high school student. So it's my great honor to hear your speech. And my question is that we know that the electricity demand grows quickly due to the AI and data center development. And we will most likely have a power shortage in the near future. So my question is, as a former Secretary of Energy, do you think we should build more nuclear generators to meet the growing demand?
Well, the short answer is I'm in favor of nuclear, but we have to learn to build nuclear reactors on budget, on time. There is a hope because China is building some 24, and they're on budget, on time. The last two the United States built were more than a factor 2 over budget, but their budget was $30 million or 25. So if you're it's a $25 billion deficit, you can't do this. So what's the secret? You take a design, you have the same crew, you build a reactor. Same crew, same design, build another one. Same crew, build another. If you build one reactor as a one-off each time, because of different regulations, state, local regulations, it's a losing proposition. So we have to have a national standard, and then we can proceed, because that method does work. But we'll need lots of forms of energy. Nuclear gives many countries energy stability. If you're an island nation, or kind of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, you would like to have nuclear. But I'm most hopeful about the transformer stuff of solar plus battery storage or wind plus battery storage. So we need the combination of everything. It's not clear that we really are going to run into an energy shortage. Energy shortage means the price goes up and it kind of self-regulates. The exascale investors and designers are really under the gun to increase efficiencies by orders of magnitude. They have already done it in hardware and software by order of magnitude. And so this will happen as well. Otherwise, it's going to be self-limiting. But be that as it may, it'll be a double-digit use of our electricity overall. It'll be 10, 15, maybe even 20%, but certainly going to go 10%. But anyway, that's where we are.
Okay, let's go to the lady over there in the front. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Callie. I'm in 9th grade, and I was wondering, what are some possible challenges that the world would face in the transition to sustainable energy?
A whole bunch of challenges. In the transition, the first challenge is I'm really afraid that local fragile agricultures will fail, and those fragile countries may fail because of that. But in terms of how do you incorporate these changes? How do you, there's incumbent pressure to, we still run mostly on fossil fuel around the world, and the fossil fuel providers are trying to, stay alive. But it's a losing battle because it's getting so much better and cheaper that I'm very hopeful that we can transition faster. But there is this pressure to slow it down. But in the end, I'm very hopeful. I wish we did not have the pressure to slow it down. It's a very quick one-to-one correlation between countries that have oil and gas under the ground and trillions of dollars under their feet versus and their view on climate change. There's a correlation there.
Okay, over there. The gentleman with the orange tie. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I'm Paul Wong. I'm professor of cardiovascular medicine at Stanford. How do you think we can transform science education in the United States as well as support for science research?
Well, that's a great question. And yesterday, the closing session, Carl Wyman, Nobel Laureate, who gets the Nobel Prize for Bose-Einstein condensation, gave a wonderful talk. He's doing research in how people learn science and engineering, and not by the formal lecture, here's material, go learn about it, but actually how to stimulate people into thinking like a scientist, breaking it up apart into simple pieces, trying to make associations. So he gave a wonderful lecture on that, and then tried, as a scientist, he actually tried to dispassionately measure outcomes, and it looked pretty convincing. I've heard his talk many times, but it's convincing that this method does work, that we want to teach people how to think like scientists. The facts themselves are far less important than how to actually, when you learn about a new problem, how do you gather information, how do you sift through what's reliable, what's not, how do you think it through, how do you divide it into doable pieces, and those sorts of things. So I think he should be giving many, many talks like this.
Right.
It was a great talk, and so a lot has been known. Sadly, we still do things mostly the old-fashioned way, formal lectures. And the physics department at Stanford is changing dramatically in that respect, into his way of teaching. But we'll see.
Question in front.
Sure. Yeah. Hello, Professor. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here and hearing your talk. My name is Mohammed Samawat. I am from Terry Sinofsky Lab at the Salk Institute in UCSD. I did my PhD and post-PhD postdoc with Terry on computational neuroscience with engineering background. Currently, we have a huge demand from the public for the current AI performance, and there's a huge supply. And to some extent, it is inefficiently using Earth energy significantly, but we have result of billion years of evolution, human brain that performs at 20 watts of energy, and brain-inspired AI and brain-inspired lower power consumption energy would be helping the Earth to save more energy. Instead of producing more energy or investing on the GPUs and all of these, we can invest on that. So we need governmental activities like Brain Initiative. We need more brain initiatives. Instead of cutting the grants, there should be more grants, more national level efforts to change the paradigm.
Is that a question?
Yeah, so I want to know. Right? So
we agree.
Yeah. So the question is that why it's not happening? Because you're a person from government. Why we see that it's left alone?
Yeah. First, I agree with you. If you compare AI today and machine learning today with trillions of parameters. And you look at the energy consumed. And for the last half dozen years, I give talks about this, and I show a 4-year-old child and a little girl petting a cat, and saying, look, by 4 years old, if their mother speaks one language, the father speaks a language, and the living student or whatever speaks a third language, they figured it all out. They become fluent in everything, all by themselves. They can tell the difference in cats and dogs all by themselves, and orders and orders of magnitude less data. So oh, by the way, 20 or 30 watts. Half of the energy of a toddler goes into the brain. And so compared to hundreds of megawatts to going to a gigawatt. So what's the difference? So one of the things is the brain right now is much more highly connected than any semiconductor system we have. A brain, typically one neuron talks to 1,000, in the hippocampus and other places, 10,000. So we don't yet have the ability to connect these chips, GPUs or CPUs, in this highly connected way yet. And so, but even if we did, it's not clear what the architecture will be. There are attempts to try to get this very distributed parallel architecture going, but we need that as well. In the end, yes, the example of nature is it's so much better, and it's incomparable. But anyway, that's what I think is the hang-up, the interconnect issue.
So I see the red light flashing out here. One final word, Steve, to the younger people out here.
First, to younger people, I apologize to you for what my generation has done. And the fact that half of them don't seem to care. And so I profoundly apologize for that. We're leaving you with an inherited problem, and it's not what humanity is based on. The goal was always to make the world of our children and grandchildren better than the world we were born into. And unfortunately, we're not doing this now. We're handing you a real problem. And so, again, I apologize, but I'll do my best to do it. But you're gonna have to think about the issues. If there is any way, you don't have to be a technologist, a scientist, or an engineer. Even in the social sciences, you can make contributions. And think about what's really important, not only to your personal life, but to your friends, your family, your country, the world, and especially the world. And so there are many of issues. And so, apply your energy. And also, I see a newfound idealism in the last decade that was absent a couple decades before. Maybe in the 60s and early 70s, there was this idealism. I find it now coming back. So keep it up.
There is hope.
And apply your talents to solving the problems.
Let's give a big round of warm applause to Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve and Arun. Steve, I hope you have gained your parents' appreciation. You are no longer the bottom of the kid in your family.
I have to tell you this one true story. When I was awarded the Nobel Prize, I called my mother. I said, Mom, I have news for you. And she said, what is it? She said, I just got a Nobel Prize. She says, that's nice, but when are you going to visit me next? A few hours later, she calls me out and says, Stephen, it's true. I didn't think that would happen.